Hi everyone, it's Laura here for SugarPea Designs, and in today's video I'm going to share with you how to create a cute Thanksgiving card with a vintage feel to it. As a first step, I used the leaf cover plate die by SugarPea Designs to dry emboss some cardstock. This is some light yellow cardstock which has a pearlescent finish, and while you normally would use this cover plate die to die cut cardstock, you can also use it to dry emboss it if you use one of those embossing mats in your die cutting machine. I then moved on to my images, and these are from the Indian Summer stamp set by SugarPea Designs. It's a very cute stamp set full of adorable images which are great for your fall themed cards, but not only actually. You can see, for example, this raccoon here would be great for any type of card really. I stamped them on some Nina Solar White 110 pounds cardstock, and this time I used some brown ink. I used Memento Dewdrops in the color Rich Cocoa, and I decided to use brown rather than the more traditional black because I felt it would add even more to the fall feel of this card. For my coloring today, I'll be using Illustrator markers, and even here I'm coloring my images in a bit of a different way than I would normally do. When coloring raccoons, I usually use some warm gray markers, but I felt that they would be still a little bit too cool for the color palette I had in mind for my card, so I am using some browns. These are from the MB family of the Illustrator markers. These are some more ashy browns, and I used EB4, MB4, MB3 and MB1 for the darker areas of his head and body, and then I used MB1 and the colorless blender for the areas that I wanted to look white. I'm adding a second layer of MB1 there in those white areas to add a little bit of contrast, and adding just a tiny bit of shadow with MB3 under his arm and his head. For those areas on the side of his cheeks, I used EB4 and MB4, and then I am going to use some skin tones for the inside of the ears. These are FS5, FS8 and FS9, and later on I'll be using FS5 also to color in his cheeks. For the turkey, I used some different browns. These are more reddish and are from the RB family. I started by laying down my RB4 marker on the outer areas of his head and his body, and also at the base of the feathers. I then blended it out with my RB2 marker, and lastly with my RB1. I'm also going to go in with a second layer of color in order to intensify the contrast and create even more dimension on my images. And then I'm going to finish off my coloring by adding some BO3 to the beak and the feet of the turkey and some CR8 to the snood. Once I was done coloring, I die cut everything with the Indian Summer coordinating dies. I'm securing them to my cardstock using some low-tack tape, and I'm running them through my die cutting machine. I am then going to create a die-cut pie using the Cutie Pie dies by SugarPea Designs. I'm die-cutting my shapes out of some Nina Solar White 110 pounds cardstock because I'm going to add some coloring to these die-cuts with my Illustrator markers again. I used GB9, GB7 and GB3. Actually here you see me going in with GB6, but I didn't like the color, it was a little bit too yellow, so I'm going to go over that with a GB7 marker. Again, adding a second layer of color because I like to have a lot of contrast on my images or on my die-cut images, and then I'm moving on and coloring the rest of the pie. This, by the way, is a standalone die set, but there is also a stamp set with coordinating dies which matches very closely this die set here. These are all part of the latest release by SugarPea Designs and are available, like all the products that I'll be using today, on the SugarPea Designs store. And if you're interested, I will have a list of the products I used with links in the description box down below. I also die cut the rim of the pie, and I colored it again with those same GB9, GB7 and GB3 markers. Once I was done coloring, I started assembling the pie, and because this die cut is so thin, I'm going to use a glue pen to adhere the rim to the base of the pie itself. And then I decided to create a little backer for that top portion of my pie, because as you can see, the die cuts 3 slits, but I would have basically had my background peeking through if I hadn't backed it. So what I did is I added some color to a scrap piece of Nina Solar white cardstock that I had on my desk, and then I glued it behind the top portion of my pie and trimmed off the excess. In order to give a bit more of a vintage feel to this card, I decided to use my Distress Oxide in Vintage Photo and a stencil brush, and I brushed my oxides along the edges of the base panel and also around my images. Because I die cut the images, I have this white outline which I felt was going to be a little bit stark. And by brushing my Distress Oxides along the edges, I softened it up, so the images will still be separated from the background because of that outline, but it will not be as strong as I said. Next, I created another panel using the postage stamp dies and some watercolor cardstock, and I'm using a fun technique with my Distress Oxides to create a kind of a watercolor type look. I have my buffalo check background stamp on my desk. I inked it up with Distress Oxide in the color Fired Brick, and then I used a distress sprayer to lightly spray my stamp with some water. I'm going now to press my panel face down onto the stamp and rub the back so that I transfer the ink. And then I can carefully lift off my die cut panel, and here you can see the result with this looser watercolor type look. I sped up the drying process with my heat gun, and like for every other element on this card pretty much, I used my stencil brushes and Distress Oxide in Vintage Photo to add a bit of a distressed and aged look to that panel as well. I then stamped my sentiment with Memento Dewdrops in Rich Cocoa on some watercolor cardstock. This is Canson XL watercolor cardstock, and the stamp that I used for the sentiment is part of the Indian Summer stamp set. I decided to rip the sentiment strip with my hands and again to brush its edges with Vintage Photo, and I have to say that I really love the look. As you see, I had tried stamping directly on that checkerboard panel, but the sentiment wasn't showing enough, so that's why I used this sentiment strip instead. The next elements that I created to decorate my card front are these leaves, and for those I used the Floral Pocket Tag die by SugarPea Designs. I die cut some Nina Solar White 110 pounds cardstock, and then I used my Illustrator markers to color them as well. I used 2 color combinations for the leaves. They are EB4, TN7 and BO3, and EB3, GB6 and GB3. And then for those branches up there that I am about to color, I used YG3, YG2 and YG1. And as you can see, I'm adding the shadows towards the centers of the leaves and the branches, and then I'm blending them out with my midtones first and then my highlight markers. At this point, everything was ready and I could go ahead and assemble my card. I mounted the background on a top folding A2 card base, cut at 4 1/4 by 11 inches and scored at 5.5 inches. I then adhered this postage stamp panel, slightly off-centering it towards the right for a little bit of interest in the design. I adjusted the sentiment strip a little bit so that it would look nice on my card design, and I curled the left edge too. And then I adhered it to my card base, aligning it with the edge of the card. Next, I adhered my images. I started from the pie that I glued down to the bottom right corner of that postage stamp panel, and then I added the raccoon and the turkey. I arranged my die-cut branches and the leaves all over the card front to fill in the design a little bit more, and I glued them down with my Nuvo Deluxe adhesive. I think that the design looked really cute even without the addition of these elements here, but I feel that they took the card up a notch. As a last step, I added a few gold details with a Sakura Jelly Roll pen just to the center of the leaves, and that finished off my card. And here you can see the final result. It's really cute with that raccoon and the turkey, and I have to say that I really love this rustic and vintage feel. And that's it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I inspired you to create with the SugarPea Designs Indian Summer Stamp Set. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more paper crafting and card making inspiration. Thank you all so much for stopping by, and have a great day.